All right, I apologize for my voice. I've been way overdoing it talking this weekend. I promise I'm not sick. So this year, PMP Pals launched the Caregiver's Corner. If Miss Connie was here, she would be doing this introduction herself. The Caregiver's Corner is an initiative to support our wonderful caregivers who we started learning a lot about today with our panel. We're excited today to introduce our first ever in-person Caregiver Forum, which is going to give voice to the unique experiences of our caregivers. Starting us off is Dr. Zachary White, who is co-author of the book, The Unexpected Journey of Caregiving, The Transformation from Loved One to Caregiver. He earned his PhD in communication from Purdue University and is a professor of communication at Furman University. His academic research and teaching focus on helping people manage meaning and communicate challenging life and relational experiences amidst high levels of uncertainty and stress, including caregiver communication. After Dr. White's presentation, we're going to have a breakout where he will continue the conversation in the room next door where we had dinner last night, and we will have a separate survivorship conversation for patients. So the caregivers will move next door and we will stay here. So it is a pleasure to welcome Dr. Zach White.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank all of you, and PMP Pals in particular, and the fact that all of you are gathered together, which is an incredible accomplishment. I know that you chose Charlotte for its proximity and changing it up a little bit, and I'm really grateful that it provided me an opportunity to speak to you. You noticed that in the introduction that Lindsay provided, I'm not a medical doctor, and that's important to note, but what I am, I've spent the last 25 years exploring, understanding, researching, and unfortunately living the caregiving experience in many ways. I was drafted in this experience when I was getting my PhD at Purdue University, and my mother was diagnosed with brain cancer, and I went back and forth during that time to be with her and my dad as he was the primary caregiver, and I learned so much during that time. One of the things that I learned was that someone who was earning a PhD in communication, I felt ill-equipped and completely inadequate to manage and understand what you may be experiencing in many ways now. And so I spent the arc of my career, I changed the direction I was going. I was still in communication, but really exploring how do we make sense of our experiences? How do we think about illness? How do we narrate our experiences in ways that shape us and our loved ones at a critical time in our lives that we did not experience or anticipate? And so I want to applaud the organization because very few times do we have both the patient and the loved one in the same space. And that is essential for many reasons. So I also want to add before we get started here that this will be interactive. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak in ways that you inject your own experiences. You are the experts. So you're not going to see me today tell you what your experiences are. Everyone's experiences is distinct, particular, idiosyncratic, born out of life experiences, previous relationships, particular diagnoses, nature of the progression of the diagnoses. But what I hope to share with you are some lessons that may transcend, and you can begin to think about a language to describe your experiences in ways that you may not have or be familiar with, because you're in it. And when you're in something, it's difficult to get space enough to be able to make sense out of it in ways that you can communicate to yourself, but just as importantly, to explain to others. So let's go ahead and jump in here. And, this transformation from loved one to caregiver is a transformation that most of us don't think about, largely because if you can think about it, it's going to be difficult actually, wherever you are in your trajectory, whether it was last year or 5 years ago or 20 years ago, life before caregiving, it seems like a different world perhaps, doesn't it? It's almost difficult to remember or recollect who or how you interacted, but all of us have clear relationships and roles that shape us. And we can identify probably with many of these roles, and they're important, right? The one thing to keep in mind is at some point in our lives, there was maybe a moment in which these were not only our primary relationship, but they were pure. as pure as they get, to the extent that may not represent or characterize your current experiences, which is much more cloudy, much more ambiguous, doesn't quite fit in any of these as much as it is a combination of a variety of things. So if you're a parent of a loved one that's here, right, you're thinking about, okay, yeah, there was a time when my parental role, I had a set of guidelines and understandings about how I should act, but maybe right now it's a little bit fuzzy and confusing and different than what you anticipated or not what you wanted, not what you feel comfortable with in a variety of ways. One of the challenges that everyone in this room faces is that you can see what's missing up here. Of course, I didn't list all recognizable or discernible or kind of hallmark experiences. You know, you go, I don't know if you can get Hallmark cards in grocery stores anymore, but you used to be able to walk down the aisle and you could go find a category in one of these, right? You know, someone's getting married or they're having a child. Maybe you don't give a card to someone who's getting a divorce. I don't know, perhaps they do now. But this is a life cycle that we kind of recognize. There are what I will call scripts that are implicit, that help guide us, that help us orient ourselves, but also help others respond to us. Know what to say, know when to call, know when to text. And even as far as through retirement. But you know what's glaringly missing here, right? I mean, what you're going through right now as caregivers and loved ones is not here. In the 21st century, we still do not acknowledge the caregiver role in the way that we do here. Most people not in this room don't think they will ever be in this room, right? Maybe you yourself, as recently as a year, didn't think you'd be in this room. I've had a few conversations with some of you, and you would have never anticipated what you're experiencing now, right? With the rarity of the disease that you are experiencing and the condition. But this life role of caregiving is invisible. It's an invisible transformation. When I say it's invisible, I'm not saying it's not real. It's absolutely real. But it's invisible to the world outside in many ways. Largely because the disorientation that you may have experienced or are in the midst of right now is largely shaped because it doesn't quite fit within the primary relationship that you have with your loved one. For example, you may be a parent caring for a child, right? All of a sudden, but the outside world just sees you as a parent still. And it's kind of, well, that just fits within all of the auspices and duties and roles and responsibilities of a parent. Yes, it does, but it's much more complicated than that. Likewise, if you're a spouse caring for a loved one who is recently diagnosed or is living with a condition, you are a spouse. That doesn't go away, but you are also a caregiver. But most people will only see you, acknowledge the role that they understand, the role that they identify with. Because when you add this caregiver experience to these roles, not only does it change the experience, but it makes people uncomfortable. They don't know how to deal with it. They don't know how to respond. They also don't want to talk about things that they fear perhaps themselves. So we're going to spend a few minutes here talking about this transformation from loved one to caregiver. And, you know, culture talks a lot about transformations, right? I mean, usually transformation is like a before and after house scene. You know, you're going to make over the house. And before you get the picture and you walk in like, oh, that's a terrible looking house. And afterwards, someone does an incredible amount of work and it looks radically different. Or you go on the Oprah Winfrey show and, you know, you talk about like kind of the transformation of weight loss or whatever it might be. And there's usually a clean before and after picture. And we say, wow, look at that transformation. The goal today is that's not clear for what we're doing, right? But there is transformation happening. And the extent to which you can understand and identify these moments of transformation is vital to your own well-being as a loved one, and also your motives, your willpower, your sense of value in your role as a caregiver. This is the great challenge before us. And I want us to be able to articulate with language some of these experiences so we can identify those moments and hold on to them to make them legitimate for us as a pathway to reaching out to others. And so this disorientation occurs in large part because it shapes how you approach caregiving. If you can think back, or it's unfolding present for many of you, in terms of how your primary relationship was shaped as you approach caregiving. I mean, both the loved one and the caregiver are probably in the midst of something like this, where they're saying, this is not what I wanted. I mean, I think that's a given, right? That's a given. And that shapes your relationship. Because some of the other life roles that I highlighted were choice-based. And you might have said, well, those are things people want, or they make choices about. So this is one of those weird things about the relationship and the category of caregiving that you're in. It's both something that you would not ever not want to do, but would never want to do at the same time. So there's this tension going on. It's not what I expected. It's not what I wanted. It's not what we wanted. And you know what? I'm finding myself, it's changing, like all the expectations throughout my life about what this role is, or how I relate to my loved one as a caregiver or as someone who's caring for the person going through this. It's a little bit scary because it's threatening things that I once got value from this relationship. It's making things much more complicated than I ever thought. And let's see if we can kind of diagnose this in ways that resonates with you. You know, like most roles in your life or most jobs, you don't show up the first day, right? You don't kind of do onboarding and you go through the HR checklist and you learn all the things you're supposed to be doing and you meet all the stakeholders who are involved in the role that you might be playing. No, I mean, like, think about your own experiences. Was there an onboarding period? Likely not. You were thrust into this role in a way that was absolutely unexpected, and all of a sudden you are being moved from one appointment to the next or in the midst of radical uncertainty. And that's why I like to think about this is you don't step into the caregiver role, it steps into you. And at the idea of choice and agency here in the beginning is radically unsettled. I would like you to think about this question today and throughout the remainder of your conference here. You know, how do you perform this role that you're in? And, you know, as a loved one, you're also performing a role. But as a caregiver, how do you perform this role in ways that honors you and your loved one? The medical establishment oftentimes doesn't acknowledge your role, although I think there was some good conversation here this morning, and that hopefully is changing in many ways. But honoring you and your loved one, this is not a role that we may have volunteered for. This is not a role that we wanted. This is not a role that we expected. But I still believe that the way in which you perform the role and how you think about the role is vitally important, not only to your own well-being and sense of value, but also for the person that you care for. So today I'm going to highlight 3 challenges, and I think 3 opportunities that you have before you wherever you are in the trajectory of your experiences. And so the challenges are just, at least they can be conversation pieces throughout the conference, conversation pieces at dinner, conversation pieces with your loved one on the travels back from wherever you came, or for yourself. There are other challenges, no doubt, that you experience, but these are 3 that I think are essential in terms of helping you better understand what you do and the value embedded in what you're doing. And the first challenge is, you know, are you a caregiver? Throughout my hundreds of interviews with caregivers across this country, this is a challenge for people. This is a remarkable challenge. And I'm going to talk about why it is a challenge, and then we're going to talk about what the opportunity there might be in terms of how you're going to address this question. Who wants this label, right? I mean, who wants to self-identify and see themselves as a caregiver for some of these reasons, right? I mean, first off, most of the outside world, outside of this room, doesn't acknowledge what you do because most of your work, most of the labor, most of the emotional experiences happen inside the home or in private spaces where they're not seen. You don't go to a waiting room to do the caregiving duties, right? They are transcendent. They are all the time. They are not bound by 9 to 5 hours. And you probably don't think of yourself as a caregiver, or at least initially reluctant to identify as a caregiver, because we think caregivers are people who have specialized degrees or medical degrees or acronyms after their names like RN. And that might be very well true inside a formal medicalized institution or hospital. But we almost like, well, that's not for me. You have to have special credentials. You have to have special expertise to do that. And I think something else that makes it difficult for people to think about themselves as caregivers is that people become very concerned or don't know how to respond when this role involves both love and care. I mean, like an RN has care, and they care about you, but they don't have a pre-existing relationship with you. And that changes everything. All of you have had a pre-existing relationship with the person that you care for. And that is the most beautiful thing, and it is also something that makes it radically different. It is not something that you specialize in. This cannot be contained, because love and care don't respect boundaries. And then I hear this refrain often when talking with caregivers, that the idea that you don't believe you're doing something special, that you're doing something that is characteristic of what you believe you should be doing for your loved one, but because it's embedded within love and care, it can't be something special. I don't believe that. But that is maybe why, in many ways, some of us are reluctant to identify with what in many ways might be a stigmatized label as caregiver. And so you might find yourself 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years into this, still clinging solely to your primary relationship title while doing caregiving duties and keeping that as kind of an invisible relational status. And typically when that happens, there's this sense that, I'm just going to continue doing this because I hope or believe or want to believe that it's temporary. That if I can just get back to the way it was prior to what has transpired since diagnosis, then I can go back to the way it was. And I'm really hopeful that that is the case for all of you, but my experience with caregivers is that it spans the life cycle. I have worked with people who have caregiven for 45, 50, 60 years of their lives, and they find themselves at some point saying, when does my life begin? Like, when does this, as a component of my experiences, become real and valid, rather than waiting for something to happen that may not be possible? It almost devalues what I'm doing every day and how I'm interacting with my loved one and the way in which I see myself in relationship to others. And this negatively affects our capacity to pay attention to how we are being transformed every day. These are all conditions, right? Well, I will, this is going to be over. When life gets better, I'll consider how I'm going to account for this care component of my experiences. When things return to normal, if I can just keep going just long enough to overcome this. While that may be the motive for the medical world, I don't think it's the motive for the private world. I don't think it's the motive for people who are engaged in what you are engaged in, which is one of the most challenging life roles that we know of. And most don't know of it, but you know it in ways that are difficult to communicate the depth and the breadth and the complexity and the weight of what you experience. So with the challenge of whether or not you want to acknowledge your caregiver experiences in I'm a parent and a caregiver, I'm a spouse and a caregiver, that and is going to matter here. I think that's important to do so for the following reasons. This is my challenge to you, the opportunity to think about this. I would never tell you what you need to self-identify as. But I think that what happens if you don't acknowledge this component of your role as a vital component of an additive to your primary relationship is you're going to miss out on these opportunities. If you acknowledge your role, you can pay attention to it in ways that you wouldn't if you only lean on your pre-existing relationship title. And you'll miss out on this opportunity for higher quality creativity, which allows you to examine the role and the problems that the role might be presenting to you and your loved one. If you ignore it, the problems don't go away, but you're less likely to be creative at a time when I believe you need to be most creative, when you feel least equipped and most overwhelmed. The research will also tell us that the quality of performance of a role like caregiving is predicated on the time and effort in exploring the problem. How is caregiving affecting me? How is it affecting my loved one? How is it affecting how I see my relationship with my loved one? Not acknowledging the caregiver title diminishes your capacity to explore and make sense. And I think it diminishes your capacity to creatively respond to what's unfolding. Because if you are busy waiting, then you won't attend to the kinds of urgencies and exigencies that you might need to that go beyond the medical. Because things are transforming whether we acknowledge them or not. And it's much more difficult to make sense of them and to address the real unfolding challenges that you experience on a daily basis that are almost always conflated with the medical. One of the opportunities of exploration is as it pertains to relationship confusion. That's what Donna and I use in the book to talk about what happens here. This misalignment of expectations when you're in the caregiver relationship. And it's typically plays out in a variety of ways. One of them is competing relational identities. Many caregivers find themselves in a position of saying, hold on a second, I find myself 6 months into this role, and I find myself more like a nurse than a spouse. And it bothers me. It bothers me because I feel like my spousal identity is being taken away from me in ways that I don't want to happen. Or if you are a child, or if you're a parent caring for a child, you might find that the way in which you interact with your child is radically different than you wanted. They're an adult or they're near adult status, and now they are needing me in ways I didn't anticipate, which shapes them and also me. We call these kind of transgressive kinds of roles where you find yourself doing things because of your caregiver role in ways that compete with what you would ideally want to experience with your loved one. And it's very unsettling because, once again, we return back to the idea that you may not have choice. But exploring that can be helpful to understand what actually exists and what expectations are in competition with one another. If not, they just live in your head. And when they live in your head, you might just label that frustration. You might just label that disappointment. You might just label that I'm getting a lot more arguments with my loved one than I thought I would be. When you're able to explore how these two roles are working together at times and working against each other at times, allows you to at least identify what's happening rather than assuming it's about something else. Let's see how we're. Let's do this exercise here, and we'll continue this exercise in the workshop after. But if you have a pencil or pen, or you want to just put it in your phone, or you want to say, oh, I'm not doing an exercise, that's fine too. I'm open to whatever you want to do. But first thing I'd ask you to do is just write down your primary relationship with your loved one prior to caregiving. And I know you know that. The next question is a little bit more difficult here. If you can, write down what you believe were the top 3 expectations in that role prior to caregiving. So like if you put down parent, like when you understood that role prior to caregiving as a parent, what would you, like you write it down. You don't need to share this with anyone. I know it may be difficult to go back then to remember that. And yeah, it's hard to narrow it down to 3, but just see if you can. And I only ask you to write it down because when it is in your head, it's evasive. When you write it down, it's like you can at least get it out of yourself, get a little separation of time and space, which you don't have as a caregiver, because it's always urgent and it's always overwhelming. And here, just get a little space from it. If you writing down the top 3 your expectations in your role prior to caregiving. Okay, third question. What kind of expectations do you or others, perhaps your loved one or your family, have for you as a caregiver? Write down your top 3. There's no right or wrong here. So these are expectations that either you have in your caregiver relationship, or your loved one might have, or you perceive your loved one having. Final thing I'm going to ask of you here. This is the part that you can do on your own, or you can use it as a conversation piece, or we can talk about it in the workshop after. But having them have the primary relationship expectations, the caregiver relationship expectations, and then identifying if you can, what expectations might be competing with one another. I always look for which one wants to take out the other, which ones are incompatible, which ones are difficult to pull off. Remember, this is why most people aren't talking about this outside this room, because they see, well, this is the parent role, these are the set of expectations, but you layer caregiving, just layering it doesn't mean it all fits together. Those oftentimes have to be negotiated or at least articulated so you know what's happening. And this is why the opportunity here is to go deeper into understanding what works well with these, what doesn't. And I'm not for any second thinking that you can just say, well, I'm going to get rid of that one. No, it's actually how do you accommodate that in ways that make sense for you or both. If you feel comfortable, only if you feel comfortable, at your table, if you want to just identify one type of expectation that might compete generally as for a loved one and a caregiver. I'll give you 2 minutes to do that, only if you feel comfortable. If you do not, you can just stare at me and make me uncomfortable. That's fine too. But go ahead if you feel like, there's differences, but there's a lot of similarities here. You know what exploration sounds like? It sounds like it sounds like your voices. Exploration doesn't have to be a solo endeavor. You're going to hear this repeatedly from me. Like, this is why you have an incredible organization here, because bringing people together to be able to talk about some of these things in ways you don't even know where to begin with others is invaluable. So this is both a private enterprise where you can explain and explore in the context of your own relationship, but also across relationships, because there are commonalities in terms of just expectations that are seemingly incompatible or challenging. I hope those conversations continue, and I apologize for interrupting. I always take that as a good sign, because you could have just stared at me, but you chose a different path because you are here, and being here is quite invaluable. Okay, just 2 more challenges here. One of the challenge that I think is in front of you, that all of you experience, is what keeps you going as a caregiver in the midst of challenge and frustration. And I'm adding challenge and frustration because that's not what the rest of the world wants to talk about. Like, your caregiving role, you love the person you care for. The role can be challenging and frustrating. Let's say the role is inevitably challenging and frustrating. Not acknowledging that, I think, is kind of erasing your experiences in many ways. It doesn't for any moment mean that you don't love the person that you care for. And this matters because motivation, that kind of intrinsic sense of why you're doing what you're doing, you score higher than any other role, any other relationship, because you love the person you're caring for. I mean, like, you're off the charts. When they examine willpower or motivation in other contexts, like, it's going to fall much lower. Like, what's the greatest motivation than caring for someone that you love? Like, super high motivation. You want the best for the person that you're caring for. And you will probably have told yourself and others that you will do anything or almost anything for them. And you wouldn't expect that from the medical practice. I mean, like, that's not part of that role description, right? So you score off the charts when it comes to motivation. However, in the midst of that, it doesn't mean that motivation is kind of a straight line across the longitudinal experiences of what you're going through. This is why I think it's important for us to think about and recognize that as a challenge, is that when caregiving becomes challenging and frustrating, we are most vulnerable to take the path of least resistance and lean on existing scripts. And when I say scripts, I'm not like, think of movie scripts if you want, but all roles in life have scripts. You know, that's how we know what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to respond, and how we know when we're doing well, and how we know when we accomplish something, and when others can respond to us likewise. So roles are almost always co-constructed. The challenge here is that you're most likely to rely on your primary relationship script when you are frustrated and overwhelmed. This is really not fair. It's asking you to be creative, to create or revise your existing script when you feel least equipped to do so, because you got so much else going on. So the existing scripts, when I said the existing scripts, so these would be kind of your primary relational scripts, right? You're going to borrow from, well, this is what a parent does, or this is what a spouse does. And we're going to lean on familiar scripts of acting and behaving and responding and thinking about things, because we don't have the cognitive luxury of being able to take on new things. If, you know, this script has worked for me my entire life, and so I'm going to go back to it again, because I need to take some shortcuts here. I don't even have the energy or time to think about, I'm not rewriting anything. And I don't even think that if I did rewrite something, that somehow it would give me any other output or outcome than what currently exists. So, like, this is how we think under duress, right? And this is typical, is normal. There's nothing wrong with that. There are some challenges that if we solely lean on existing scripts, But I mean, it is confusing and challenging because there is no such thing as a caregiving script. Because it's an invisible life role, we oftentimes culturally and familially don't talk about, well, what is a caregiver supposed to do? And how is a caregiver supposed to feel or experience their role? I mean, you might say, I'm glad you're speaking, but I don't believe you. You might say some of these things. These are my anticipated retorts that you might have about what I'm saying here in terms of developing or revising a script to pay attention to the caregiving component. Well, you know, it's just it's just expected of me. So why would I think that there's something that can come out of revising the script? I'm doing what's expected of me. There is no script. I just have to do what I need to do, okay? It's what I expect of myself because I do love my loved one, and I'm going to do what's expected of me. Yeah, well, and it's always on. It's 24/7. Other people are sleeping, and I'm doing other things in ways that people don't acknowledge. I don't have the time or bandwidth to do it. And you know what? How can I ever find success in this role when this is not where we want to be? Like, this is a real threat to motivation. If you don't know when you're being successful at a role that others don't understand, and maybe you and your loved one don't want to be in this situation, but you have to be able to find moments of success and barometers for success. Because like any role, those are guides, and those are benchmarks. If we don't have benchmarks, motivation is usually a casualty. Hey, you know, doctors and technology are just more important than anything I do, so I recognize my role may not be very important. Why revise this? Why spend time exploring this? Motivation doesn't matter when I have no choice. I don't believe these, but these are common retorts. Like, motivation absolutely matters even when you don't have choice. And you know, it doesn't matter what my script is. I don't have much control of what is happening. And this might be the most pernicious one out there. Caregivers, unlike most others, recognize the fragility of life. Recognize that what we want doesn't always occur. And that how today is not how today may be. You may have found yourself in this situation that it's difficult at times to maintain your motivation, even though you loved your loved one, when you don't feel like the script of the role and relationship you're in is kind of meaningfully or authentically connected to your everyday realities. What people think you're doing is very different than what you're actually doing. What people think the role is about may be very different than what you are finding, seeing, and doing on a daily basis. And that incompatibility can be overwhelming. So my challenge, my opportunity here to think about is to think about the components of your caregiver script that are within your control, even though there are givens that we cannot change. There may be givens that we cannot change, but so what do we have in control? What do we have within our control is identifying why you are doing, what does it mean for you to care for your loved one? No one will hand that to you. You need it. You need it in your back pocket. Okay, I'll move to the 21st century. You need it on your phone. Because if you don't, you have to remind yourself constantly of this. In the midst of the details, you have to know it's not a script that others are paying attention to. You will not find it in popular culture. You have to generate this yourself. Why is caring for your loved one so important to you? More specifically, how does it, these are things you control. These are things you can, no one can control this. Whatever the procedures or whatever's going on, how does it align with you and your evolving values? That is how and why you're caring for your loved one. Your values in the midst of transformation are always undergoing change. Perhaps it is helping you change your own values. That might be something that you want to identify. That is evidence that you are being transformed. And not having that in the back of your mind is a threat to motivation. This is the part that nobody pays attention to because they think it's depressing what you're doing, or there can't be good elements to this. There can't be find something that is redeeming about what you're doing, but caring for someone changes you. What aspects of your care experiences bring you closer to your loved one? you experience closeness in a way that most others do not. Identifying that is important. What experiences most remind you of the impact of your care? And then finally, something that's almost always omitted. You may be doing and experiencing and pushing yourself in ways that you would never have volunteered for, right? Well, my spouse was the one who did the checkbook, right? Managed the bills. But now you're doing that because you have no other choice because of your caregiving responsibilities and the challenges they're experiencing because of their situation. What skills or knowledge or capacities are you developing? Are you building? Or are becoming a part of what you're doing that you didn't have before? Those are growth parts of your role that most other people don't acknowledge, won't ask. So this is internal motivation, like why, this is intrinsic motivation, why you are doing what you're doing because it is meaningful to you. And that's something that we have control over, and we have kind of a responsibility for ourselves to keep us going in chronic caregiving situations. One of the challenges that you find yourself in is you might find yourself in the midst of the caregiving role and relationship feeling alone and misunderstood. And this is almost universal across caregiving, across whatever disease, condition, situation. And this idea, this imbalance between what you need and what people are capable of giving you or providing. And it's really troubling and almost beyond belief because all of you had a set of existing friends and family and support prior to your caregiving role. And then something seemingly happens in the midst of that. One of the reasons that you might feel more alone and misunderstood in the midst of your caregiving experiences is that all of a sudden, and this is not noticeable to anyone, typically, you might say, like, I don't know why I feel even more alone when I'm with friends that I've spent 20 years with. Oftentimes, there's a difference in how they assume or expect, just expectations about the world and how they act in the world. One is they have kind of more certainty, perhaps. Caregivers recognize the fragility of life. They might have more consistency. We just talked about that. They might plan for the cruise in 3 months, and you're thinking, I can't plan for a cruise. I don't know if I can plan for next week. They believe in independence, and you're saying, I've never experienced more interdependence in my life. You know, I can be my own person, but what happens at home or what happens with my loved one affects me. And to say otherwise denies or contradicts your own experiences. They have a lot of answers. Caregivers typically have a lot of questions. Their narratives about their everyday life are, it was a good day and a bad day. One of the most challenging questions for a caregiver is, how's your day going? And that might mean a lot of different things, right? I mean, it might be hour to hour, and it might be, this morning was horrible, we'll see what happens later. It's hard, that doesn't translate very well. The power to change, they believe that they have the power to change what they want or don't want. They talk a lot about their dreams and like how they're going to make things happen. And throughout your caregiving experiences, you might be reminded of a very different reality. They talk about their unchanging values. It's hard to fathom that when you're going through a transformation, as you are, that your own values and what's important to you isn't changing. That kind of silent and invisible incompatibility, the people are the same, but if you find yourself feeling a little bit adrift, a little bit out of sorts, a little bit alone, even in the company of your loved ones, it's not because they're bad people. It's because you may be beginning to see the world a little bit differently than they do. Because your experiences are characterized by things that are different from theirs. Uncertainty is an expected part of your life. Inconsistency is not a bad thing. It's just a description of your reality, not some kind of aberrant experience. We talked about interdependence. You can be remarkably sad and find a moment of connection with a loved one an hour later that defies an ability to articulate it in a way that others will appreciate. Good or bad day? Both. You might be living without answers. As much as you pull off as a caregiver and a loved one, you may feel powerless. And people who aren't in this experience may feel threatened by that. It doesn't mean you can't change things and make things better, but you also recognize there may be boundaries and things that are beyond your control. And your experience is that your own values and who you are may be changing as well. What this highlights is that what's so challenging about caregiving is not simply the caregiving tasks and obligations and themselves, but other people's judgments about your caregiving experiences. Here we move away from intrinsic motivation into extrinsic motivation. How people think about what you're doing matters in terms of your own ongoing sense of willpower related to your caregiving. Perhaps you found yourself in one of these situations. Maybe what you expected. We all have expectations. I needed someone to listen, but I couldn't find a way into the conversation to talk about what's happening with me or my loved one. Anyone had that experience? Okay, note to self, don't ask questions. May not, right? I didn't want to burden my family with what they called negativity. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, you got that one?
I was going to say, like, with family, you want to talk about kind of moving forward, and you want to discuss maybe end-of-life stuff.
Yeah.
Even if you're not there.
Yeah.
And people just
Shut it down, right? Come on, stop being so depressing.
we got to do this. We got to get the paperwork done.
But no, we don't want to talk about that right now, right?
We don't want to buy it.
Okay, that's a powerful one, yeah.
I had my wife recently say we have an appointment at Mount Sinai to buy plots,
Yep.
and that took me right down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, stop being so morbid, that's terrible. And it's just Thanksgiving, we're not going to do that here. Let's talk about happy things. And it's okay to talk about happy things, but when your own realities are being denied or ignored or underplayed, that sense of aloneness kind of, how that is a threat to your motivation, that sense of how people support you or don't support you matters. And once again, it's not because the people that we care about or spend our holidays with or our time with are bad, it's just their realities are quite different. And there is something disorienting about spending time with people that you once felt supported you or anticipated they would support you no matter what you went through, right? Our definition of friends, and you're not finding it exactly as you thought. So now it's not just you're dealing with caregiving, you're dealing with a sense of I don't even know who my friends are anymore. I don't know how to make sense. I'm infuriated by what they're doing or not doing. So instead you might be receiving from your well-intentioned family and friends, really seriously, how do you do this? How do you do it for so long? That's an impossible question for you to answer, right? How do you do this? Once again, it's a well-intentioned question, but it kind of, how long do you have, right? So you kind of draw them into that. Usually in a whisper aside, it must be really depressing. And while it might be challenging, these combined together kind of assault your own experiences. And that disconnect is a threat. So the challenge here is to resist the temptation to accept other people's impressions as your own. If you live in the scripts that work for other people, the challenge will be those scripts, those cliches, those beliefs may ask you to omit or distort your own experiences. And that's why I'm calling forth the idea of you trying to revise your own scripts so that you know and have a language to talk about it. Not that you're going to be able to necessarily correct and change how they think, but so that you know when you leave that party or when you leave that holiday experience that you take something with you rather than feeling like you were somehow denigrated, overtly or not. The challenge with other people's judgments, however well-intentioned, is they absolutely can undermine your motivation. They shape how you feel about your caregiver role, and which inevitably shapes how you orient yourself to the everyday required tasks in caregiving. And they kind of create this sense of, am I doing this right? Am I doing well in this role? Is anything I'm doing matter? So it shapes your own sense of personal accomplishments as a caregiver. And you might find yourself here in the midst of it questioning yourself in a way that kind of questions your own capacities in terms of like, what is my role if others totally misunderstand this extrinsic disconnect between what people think I'm doing and what I am doing? I don't know, maybe I'm going to ask for one more table exercise. Which one, if you feel comfortable, which one of those most resonates with you that you have asked yourself internally, or you have made, which one of these most resonates with you? If you feel comfortable sharing with your table, I'll give you 2 minutes. Whatever I do doesn't feel like it's enough. What I do isn't noticed. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't matter really what I do. My caregiver responsibilities don't stop, or no one will ever understand what I'm doing or going through. Which one, if you had to tag one, which one do you think? You can share that at your table if you feel comfortable. I'll make sure I'm done by 3:15. I'll make sure. So this is not me blaming other people, but it is a clarion call to, if we find ourselves in any one of these or all of these statements at some part in our caregiving role, it does have an impact. And so the question is, what, if anything, can we do about it? Because how we feel about something does matter. How we orient ourselves does matter. And so this is my last opportunity here. And you are already embodying this. You are doing this. So you are far ahead of the curve. At a time when you feel most overwhelmed, I'm asking maybe perhaps something that is really challenging, but it is to reach beyond your existing networks. Your existing networks, we just talked, they live a world, they don't need to evolve their values. They don't need to think about your experiences yet. They are going to support you with what they know and understand. And that they are good intentioned. But I'm challenging you to reach beyond your existing networks. You hear, you all traveled to Charlotte. So you are doing this, but I'm going to challenge you throughout the year to continue doing this. even when you may not have the energy or feel like you don't have the capacity, because I think there are incredible benefits that are not possible with well-intentioned existing support networks. Once again, I'm not critiquing your family and friends, but if those are your only set of support, you're missing out on opportunities. Some of these benefits that are overwhelming, and they are drawn from research and also caregiving research as well, but just what you were doing, I heard laughter. If you tell people about your caregiving experiences, they will interpret laughter as like, oh, we can't laugh. This is too serious, not possible, right? It has to be depressing. If it has to be depressing, I don't want you to think that I'm kind of not caring for what you're going through. Caregivers can laugh with other caregivers. They get the depth of it. They also know that it's real, and you can laugh, right? If you don't have permission to laugh, it makes life much more difficult. And you can explore the contradictions in ways that they can't even conceive of. You know, you can have joy and sadness. You can be overwhelmed and more focused than ever before. Those don't seem incongruous for caregivers. For the outside world, they're like, I don't understand. You can do what you're already doing here. Receive feedback that can help you approach challenges. Feedback that is born out of people who will not have the same experiences, although this is a rarefied group, right? You have experiences that you can approximate others and at least speak with some wisdom, right? If you're asking people who don't have lived experience in some capacity, you're asking a lot from them. And I think sometimes the impossible. And that's where a lot of the frustration comes from. We feel trapped, like, you're my friend, be better than that. Versus, you're my friend, and you're going to support me in the way that you can support me, but the people around here can support each other in ways they can't. Even though they may not be your family, and they may not be a part of your pre-existing network, but this is the ultimate invitation to a kind of support system that leverages your experiences in ways that is authentic, right? You can see a cliche coming at you a mile away, right? Well-intentioned, but shrapnel. It hurts. It gets you in ways you didn't anticipate. Try on new and creative ways of addressing challenges. You've got to be creative. We talked about you've got to be creative, finding out additional ways to make way in a world that doesn't acknowledge this role and experience that you're in. Who better to do that than these are the experts, in person or virtual. Also, engaging with others beyond your existing networks can enhance your belief in your own abilities to perform your caregiving role. Our belief in our capacity to do the role inevitably helps us be better at our role. That kind of agency is invaluable. It only is possible when you're listening and receiving and getting feedback from people who are what you consider legitimate, experienced, approximating your experiences. You can ask each other what if, not just what's wrong. This gets us away from it's depressing to what are the possibilities given the givens. That's a radically different question and approach than our well-intentioned existing support networks may be able to provide. What is possible? Others will not ask you that because they're afraid. They don't want to trespass on the decorum of being your good friend. And then finally, I've never heard it today. I've heard it. Accessing valuable resources and information and support, whether it's the surgeon or the doctors or information that you need in ways that only others can provide because they've been at this a little bit longer. And so when I hear the sounds of what you have already been experiencing today and yesterday and tomorrow, it's powerful. I applaud you on what you're doing and the sacrifice that you made to be here. It may be difficult to translate that to others. You spent the money, you did that, you took time. Absolutely. You care about this role. You care about your loved one, and you care about yourself. And you're building a network, not for advancement, but for enhancement. And that's powerful. Thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. If you want to learn more, I do have some books here from Donna and my book that introduces some of these ideas. I think we're going to take a little break, right? Is that right? And then we're going to have, okay.
So 10 minutes from now, caregivers are welcome to
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.